We are recording. Need your video to come up. Hello and welcome to episode 51 of Great Things with Great Tech, the podcast highlighting companies doing great things with great technology. In this episode, I'm talking to a company that has a vision to create and distribute world-class software products that control and protect data, to translate that data into meaningful insights, clear actions, and measurable outcomes for their clients. That company is CT4. I'm talking to Dan Pearson, CTO and founder at CT4. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Good afternoon, Anthony. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good today. So just before we get into talking about CT4 and what you guys are doing in extremely innovative ways, I just want to have a shout out to the show. If you like great things with great tech and would like to feature in future episodes, please click on the link in the show notes or go to gtwgt.com, register your interest there. Also, just be aware that GTWGT is available on all good podcasting platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, all hosted and distributed by anchor.fm and also on YouTube. So once again, please hit that like and subscribe button to get all the goodness of the episodes moving forward. Right, Dan, with that, let's crack into CT4. It's a company that you founded back in 2009. It was founded as a cloud company to start with, but maybe just give a bit of a background about yourself, where you came from, and then how you founded the company.
Yeah, so my background is I've been in tech since I was a young lad. I was an army apprentice in the UK in the British Army. I did 2 years in the apprentice and then 10 years in the army. I've always loved technology. I've always loved solving problems. I've always had a bent for this kind of innovative style approach. Worked through the industry, IBM, Microsoft, some of the big numbers. And then in 2009, we decided to start the company on problem solving, basically, see the need, fill the need.
Yeah, awesome. So what was the company founded for initially? I'm guessing at that time it was really looking around, private cloud, infrastructure, that sort of thing. Was it a managed service company to start with, or did you offer cloud hosting?
Honestly, it was as simple as one of my mates came to me and said, look, I don't want to run servers anymore. Can you run them for me and deliver it as a service? It began in my garage with an IBM server and an ADSL modem. You'd laugh how simple it was. In fact, ironically, we've still got that IBM server in our museum at CT4.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, we absolutely kept it. But it literally began as simple as that. And then he told his mates, and then it proliferated from there. We are where we are today.
Yeah. So I guess over those first, 3 to 4, maybe even 5 years, what was the sort of, in the infrastructure grew, like you said, you get more customers on board, but were you just doing that private sort of hosting for people, or because obviously today you talk about data protection and management, but was that something that you guys were doing back then out of necessity, or what was the typical customer coming to you for back then?
Yeah, look, it was, as I say, it was people coming that wanted their unique problems solved. I didn't intentionally start it off as let's do private cloud, but it was an easy entry into the market. You could literally buy tin, build a service, and deliver it to them, and off you went. You didn't have to build applications or coding or anything else. And as we'll talk about later on in the market, back in 2009, there was no VC community in Australia to speak of. You couldn't just go and raise big chunks of capital on ideas. That wasn't there. So you literally had to be turning $1 from day dot.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's an absolute necessity there. So, back then, were you guys? Did you have a front end? Did you have any automation? Did you have a console, or were you all effectively hands on?
No, look, from early days, we're all about automation and efficiencies, so we could run it, without a utility heavy model. So we did a lot of scripting. There were a lot of comparable companies around at the time, like ZetaGrid, which you'd be familiar with, over your neck of the woods, who specialised there at the extreme end of the scale, in terms of they had everything down pat. We were probably somewhere in the middle, and it grew from there, because obviously one client became 2 and then 10 and so on and so on, and we started to add people. But we never let the people overhead, overtake and get out of control.
Yeah, because today, we'll talk about today a little bit later on, but you've grown significantly over the last 3 years. You've got 100 full-time staff now around the world, but as you 130 now, outdated. There you go. My data's outdated. that's good. So even more staggering, right? And that number is not a small number in terms of employees, right? So you've obviously grown, but I think at some point over the 10-year period, you decided to, I guess the word is pivot. I don't like using it too much, but you decided to change course of the company and really focus on data and software. So maybe just explain what led you to that sort of change, which I think has set you on the path that you're on now.
You know what? Interestingly, I actually don't see it as a pivot. I see it as an evolution. I think in the beginning,
cool.
It was always about. I actually think that we have a customer was saying to us in simple terms, "I've got a load of data I want you to look after." Back then it was obviously private cloud hosting and delivering it as a service through some like desktop as a service. But the reality was, all they were saying was, "I've got a lot of data. I want you to look after it, you to protect it, and you to deliver it to me." The delivery being a desktop as a service. So when you think about where we've actually come to today, we're not, albeit we're not delivering it in that mechanism anymore. We're not owning the frontline desktop, but we're still looking after their data. And that's what we do with the Cirrus product. So when you look at where we began to where we are with Cirrus today, I think of it more of as an evolution than a revolution, if that makes sense.
That's really good. No, and a good rebuttal to the word pivot, because you're absolutely correct. It makes a lot more sense that this is an evolution of a company and just moving with the market, with the times, and where the industry is going. So you're absolutely correct. So you mentioned desktops. You guys were doing hosted desktop at one point.
We were indeed, and one of our biggest customers was based over in Western Australia, which was BHP and then South 32.
Okay,
that was arguably
know them well.
The biggest we ever did on that in that space, and they were a client for ours for a number of years. So that was what you might call, back in those days, desktop service. It emerged. It looked like the cool thing, but arguably it got usurped by Office 365. That kind of.
I remember.
Yeah,
well, actually, one of the first jobs I was tasked with at Zedigrid when I started there, all the way back now in 2013, was to update and really establish the desktop as a service play. It was within VMware Cloud Director at the time, but it was, like you say, it was kind of that. The industry was like trying to push itself towards desktop as a service, but it never quite got there. And I think, like you said, SaaS-based delivery effectively, was the reason.
Well, I always think, I think when you look at that in particular, there's always it's like a pendulum swing. So if you look at customers go from that full, I want to give everybody everything to look after, to I want to have an in-house of everything. And the thing where it's starting to fall now is somewhere in the middle. Like, I want to give the critical stuff to someone who really knows it and has that expertise. And data protection is obviously one of those areas. Versus if I gave them desktop as a service, I gave them everything, the keys to the kingdom. I had no control over it anymore. So it's an interesting journey it's taken.
Yeah, and I think that parallels the whole industry with the shift. There was an overswing, or there's parallel to cloud. Everyone said, well, the public cloud is going to eat everything, and people believe that, and it came from the top down, that they said, well, if that's what the industry is saying, we should go there. But as it's kind of swung back and kind of settled, it's obvious that it's really a horses for courses, and that multi-cloud world is really here. So it's a similar sort of situation where, I think our industry tends to go all in and then realize that maybe that's not the way to go, and then it comes back and settles in terms of where it should be.
I agree 100%. I think there's always an over-rotation when new technology comes out, and then it settles down to where we are now.
That's it. So yes, that's a really good, introduction into sort of where you are today, because where you are today, you kind of almost based around products. So you had Canopy. Well, Canopy Tools was that the name of the company for a little bit? I noticed that the company maybe changed names as such a few years ago. But talk about Canopy Tools, because this is really intriguing, because it involves collecting and taking control of data from Internet of Things devices, right? So Internet of Things is obviously was a hype word, but you guys seem to jump on that early and built some sort of software around that. So I'm intrigued as to what Canopy is.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's there's a multi-layered answer to that, as we've chatted over. You and I have chatted over a period of time that we obviously, as part of the globalization and our product strategy, we've gone through many iterations of what the company looks like, what the product lineup looks like, how it all ties together. And it began, as LinkedIn Biz. It then became CT4. It then became Canopy Tools Group. And then we realized that actually we had a really cool domain name. I mean, how many people can get CT4.com, right?
Exactly.
That's like hen's teeth.
Yeah.
So, driven down from our CEO, he's, said, look, this makes sense to have the CT4 as our overarch name. So we kind of took that as the umbrella of the company. And then we looked at our products. So we've got 3 products, which is Canopy, Cirrus, and Arado. Arado being a traditional MSP, and I won't talk too much about that. That's really our history and where we came from.
Yeah.
Canopy in itself was myself looking at an opportunity in the market where I saw these pockets of information. It comes back to data again. Pockets of information driven by sensors that had no overarch to actually display and control and manage that data. That was it. And I thought to myself, similar to Xero, where Xero, as in XERO, the finance software, similar to them, they looked at the opportunity in the market in the finance sector, particularly was that there was a gap in the market for a product that would be simple to use with a click-through complexity model. Like it starts simple and gets complex, and it interfaces into just about everything. And we pretty much followed that philosophy in the IoT space. Now, the IoT in technology, I always talk about crossing the chasm being a classic example of the evolution of adoption. A few of us know that book. It's a very well written book.
I think I was looking if I've still got it on my desktop, but I've moved it from there. But yeah, anyone has kind of read that because it is a great book.
It is a great book, and it actually tells you how you should be selling your products and who you should be telling your products to. So if we look at data protection Cirrus, it's firmly in that right side. It's mainstream. Everybody gets it. We look at Canopy, in the IT space, it was very much until recently, very much on the left side, early adopters, pioneers. And that's hard, in a market selling to early adopters and pioneers. You'll get the people that are very keen to take it on. They might not buy it in large volumes, which, you obviously need revenue.
Yep.
Your more traditional businesses are not convinced. You have to do an enormous amount of heavy lifting to convince them on the value of it. But, in more recent times, the carbon net zero and some of the global initiatives driven across the world, there's more of an appetite to go, hey, we're on the hook for making the world a better place and using data to drive outcomes. And data can obviously tell whether we're being energy efficient, fuel efficient, and so on and so on. Yeah. So all of a sudden, this market, that was firmly on the left, has started to shift into the middle, driven by necessity. And look, in a lot of respects, that's very similar as we were talking about with data backups. It's become more than backups now. It's about protection, integration into cyber, integration into compliance. Yeah. And once you elevate the products into those arenas, then all sorts of things becomes possible. Yeah,
it's really interesting because, the Internet of Things it's got kind of a bad rep to it a little bit because I never liked Internet of Things because I like to think of devices as being smart devices and beneficial and useful. But I think the way it was being sold was that we've got 1 billion, plus dumb devices out there just collecting data and they're not being very useful. Well, maybe the actual what I'm learning now is that the usefulness of those actual devices is the data that they're creating as opposed to the actual device itself. So I think I've come around a little bit in terms of, what it means to have edge Internet of Things and whatnot. But so that product though, how did it work with an Internet of Thing device to get data and present? Is it just a form to get the data into some sort of database or lake and then present it to the end user in a more meaningful way?
I guess it's kind of all of the above. One of the early things we built with the Canopy product was the ability for it to intercept 95% of devices, without configuration. So it had the ability to take a large amount of IoT devices, and believe me when I say that's not an easy task.
No,
because there isn't. Anybody that's been in the IT industry for 20 odd years remembers the days when you used to have multiple protocols like NWLink and Banyan Vines and so on and so on. Everything was talking differently, and you had to create adapters and transformation, and that's essentially what we had to do. So that was the first part. How are we going to get the data into something meaningful? Once we got it into something meaningful, it was always about how can we overlay that with the control shell? A nice UI where you can set logical rules. You can look at the aggregation of data, and then it gives you meaningful outcomes. A good example of that is, you take weather data, energy data, and then you aggregate that into an overall picture to say, are we running efficiently or not? Simple example, or water collection or whatever.
Yeah.
Because the reality is the value is not in the devices. The value in the fact is the devices can aggregate the data.
That's it.
So that they can do something meaningful with that data.
Data.
Yeah, I mean, what I mean, if I look at my cell phone, I've got about 2 or 3 IoT devices on there, apps, but they really are quite point. They don't do anything sophisticated. They turn lights on, they turn power supplies on, fridges, whatever. They're not giving me an overall picture of my house, whereas that's what Canopy would do. It would pull that in, overall picture. And then what it could do is upstream it into something useful, turn on, turn off, billing, whatever. Yeah. Data analytics, AI, the whole lot.
That's cool. I like that. It's a really interesting. Well, it's not your usual sort of evolution from cloud VM, if you know what I mean. So it's a really interesting part, and I'm glad that you guys have gone down there. But I think what this led to, and what I'm assuming it led to, in terms of the back end, has effectively led to Cirrus as well. Like it's something completely different. It's about backup, but if you didn't have Canopy, you wouldn't have Cirrus. Is that a fair call?
That is a very fair call. I think what Canopy took us on the journey of is how to create a true SaaS product, commoditize, present, everything else. And we learned a lot of lessons on that because the reality is there's no appetite in the market for consultant-led applications anymore. Those days, and I'm probably picking slightly on Salesforce because it was arguably the first SaaS app, but it's still very much, it's not an out-of-the-box app. You need a consultant, you need to use
platform, framework, yeah.
Exactly. And look, they're very sophisticated apps. As I say, I don't mean that to be derogatory towards them, but when you're looking at, if you want to get hyperscale, it's got to be a click and go experience, right? We discovered that early on in the piece.
Yeah.
And I think where that journey took us into Cirrus is we looked at it and we went, well, it's still a data play. It's a data protection play. And the reality is, I mean, we've got a world-class product that is Veeam, but it was missing that aggregation simplicity point that would take us to click and go.
Yeah.
And I think when you're targeting, as we do, the SME sector, in the 50 to 250 seats, you have to have that simplicity. You have to have that, give the customer the insights that they need without the absence of potentially an IT professional.
Yeah.
And again, I come back to it's that zero model I talked about. They nailed it by, you don't need a bookkeeper to manage your books. We can abstract that complexity and you can do it. Now, bookkeepers use Zero, so it's also good for them. And that's what we aim with Cirrus. So it could appease both communities.
Yeah. So what is Cirrus? So obviously I know, but for those listening out there, what is Cirrus, the product, and what does it do?
So Cirrus was really building on, as I say, the world-class Veeam engine. I mean, we look at it in the context of, if you look at Utes, arguably the world leader of the market was the Isuzu diesel engine. It was in a lot of models for a long time, and that's how we view Veeam. It's one of the best engines on the market. What we did is we essentially built the vehicle for the car so that, someone could literally go into a marketplace like Azure Marketplace or England Cloud Marketplace, click and go, purchase it, and be backing up in 5 minutes. And that's what we've done. That's as complicated as it gets. Now, clearly, the most complicated thing in life is making things simple. So there's a lot of work that's gone into that, working with Veeam and ourselves in the productization of that. But I think, in a short space of time, and I talk about, we went to market in July, August last year. We're 12 months in. We're into the tens of thousands of users now, tracking neatly towards 100,000 users. Obviously the market's speaking about the adoption and what they're like, and seeing that happening. So it's, as I used to say in the army, soldiers vote with their feet, and that's what we're seeing in the market. And the evolution of that, as we've talked about, Anthony, is VM.
Yeah, it's a good. The timing was right in a lot of ways, but it seemed like the timing was right with regards to you guys being ready to deliver something that is pretty unique in the industry. And I go back to my time working for service providers and thinking about how we were trying to distribute the product, right? Traditionally, it's either you have a front end where customers will swipe their credit card and it'll provision it at the back end, or it's a more manual based setup where there's a form, or you're actually doing an old school sort of, face-to-face sort of setup. Or what works in this sort of world better is the channel or reseller model, which allows you to, do something once at the top and have it spread down through partners. But the distribution through a marketplace was something that people, could never really grasp. Obviously, the hyperscalers, that's what they built on. Amazon, AWS has the marketplace where you can deploy a number of different images and services through that marketplace. But for more traditional vendors, getting that software to be sort of created and accessible via a marketplace was difficult, especially through partners. And I think that's one of the great things, for obviously speaking true to the heart from Veeam here, being able to give our software and, let you guys do great things with it. This is the reason why I created the podcast, right? Because I knew that, Veeam or any other vendor can create great software and do cool things there at that level. But it's really about what guys like you, CT4, what Dan does with that software to elevate it to the next level. That's what you've done here. So, this is really the crux of why great things with great tech exists, because I wanted to highlight this sort of evolution. But with that marketplace, just explain how that does change in terms of distribution, because it is a fundamental shift from what a lot of people have been doing over the past 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, look, I think over the last 2-3 years, I spent a lot of time looking at other companies, other tech companies, analyzing, and again, looking at books. For anybody that's listening to the podcast today, it's all about making repeatable, simple, easy ways to sell your product. There's no special sauce in this, right? There's no, if you get with Rick over at, VMware or whatever, that you're going to suddenly be majorly successful. I mean, you might make a couple of million through an enterprise deal, as we did with my earlier example, but it's all about repeatable, sustainable sales, And another great book is From the Impossible to the Inevitable.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if an author is Crossing the Chasm, but he talks about the mechanic of sales, right? Repeatable, simple, solid margins, and our marketplaces and driving demand.
Marketplaces,
and
yeah.
It's you and I both grew up in an era where golf days and everything else was popular and enterprise deals, and that's all gone in our industry for what we do. We don't deal with people. That's the whole point of SaaS software. It's there. Largely our buyers are anonymous, and that's how it should be, because we're seeing people transacting all the time. So it's got to be, we've got to have that vehicle and that ability to transact and push the demand too.
Yeah.
And that is exactly why we went down the marketplace. And, if you're going to sell software across the world, affordably, without a sales team of 20,000, doing direct sales, channels, marketplace, distribution, and lead gen is all the age staples are still true.
Yeah, I kind of think back to, what you said originally about, how you actually set up the company back in 2009 with, it was word of mouth, right? But this is actually almost the opposite to that, where it's almost like the customers come to you, the distribution is in the marketplace through some sort of person going on and saying, look, I've got a problem. I need a backup. In this case, with Cirrus, I've got to protect my SaaS data that's on SharePoint, Outlook, OneDrive, and Teams. I'm going to go onto this marketplace here and type in backup for Exchange. What's going to come up? Okay, I've got a couple of options. Let me read through. This one looks good. Let me click. It says I can be ready in 5 minutes, and I'm backing up my software. That's kind of it. It's completely hands off to you guys. You guys don't even care what customer you get, as long as you get one, right? It's generating that sort of sale at that point. So it's so hands off and so. Oh yeah, it's just so
transactional is maybe the word.
Yeah. I'm trying to find the word for it, but is that how you see it? Like it's just transactional. It's such a utility. I don't think it should be like a utility, but it is, and that's quite interesting. That through that marketplace, through your technology, through your innovation, through making something that's complex simpler, you actually have created a utility.
Yeah, look, I think you're right, and transactional is probably the right term. I mean, if I look at the Canopy product, even though it is, commoditized, it is a different buyer persona. It's a different sales cycle to Cirrus M365, that is, and shortly VM. But even then, I think VM is going to be slightly different again, because it's got a little bit more complexity.
Yes.
You and I talked about Salesforce in the future as well. I think that'd be more like M365. So they all have their slight different twists and nuances. And as a tech company, you've got to be ready for that with your sales vehicle. Your customer success, they've got to be ready to support that. And a lot of people talk to me about, building a SaaS business is just building a product, right? So that's a third of the battle. A third of the battle. The other 2/3, routes to market, simplicity, support, billing, everything else that goes through the wheel. And that's what we wrapped around the Veeam engine. We wrapped that wheel around it to make it successful into these markets. And that's what SaaS is truly about.
Yeah.
But once you conquer that and you get that insight and the access to the markets, then everything becomes possible. And then you can roll out additional options and products and so on and so on.
Yeah.
Do I think that approach fits every single company? No, it doesn't. We have, enterprises that buy Cirrus. They go through more traditional sales cycles. So it's not a one size fits all, but if you look at the mainstream of our business is aimed at that small end of town, the unloved end of town, I call it. And that's just repeatable transactional business, to your point.
Yeah. And I guess in that case, we talked about this off air, but I'd bring it up as a question. So you're basically basing customer success on a product versus the overall company or brand, aren't you? Like, I can see that Cirrus, Canopy, Arado, that is the success of the company. And a lot of companies will work off their name or their people or other bits. How's that different? And how has the marketplace enabled that for you?
Look, I think it's the people, the company values, the direction, the people are super important. There's no getting away from that. And we've got some amazing people in our organization of you obviously know a few yourself, like Martins and so on.
Yeah.
Great guys. But the market needs to see us as a commodity approach. The market needs to see us as something not quite faceless, but it's something that we can just transact, pick up. It's easy to use. And you know what? When there's a problem, I know how to get support. One of the examples that we have on that is on Cirrus. We have concierge service. So our customer success will reach out to customers, when they're 30 days into their journey, make sure they're backing everything up and everything's as they expect. And that's it, and that's light touch, but it's super powerful. It gives you that we're not an anonymous organization. Some of the larger companies, which, I won't pull the names down, you try and figure out how you're going to contact them when you've got a problem. They don't have that ability, and that's not the business we're in,
Yeah, so it's an interesting mix. I'm just thinking about it, right? Because on one hand, you're trying to be, very hands-off and transactional, which is typically the companies that you just talked about. They're those sorts of companies. But on the other side, you're still trying to maintain that touch, which I think comes from your history and your background, right? In terms of where you came from. So there's a bit of competing sort of fundamentals going on, but I think it works.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're going to be unique in the market, you can't just follow everybody else. You can't go, look, we're going to be a faceless SaaS company and they're going to suck it up. And that's just how everybody else does it. I think putting your own unique twist on it, as long as it's sustainable and it makes practical business sense, is the way to do it. That's how you differentiate.
Yeah, awesome. And I think as well, that is reflected in the fact that you guys you talked about VC funding, not being there back in the day. It's sort of, obviously we're in a bit of an interesting period at the moment with the way the market is and the world events and whatnot, but there's still the appetite there to invest into good companies. And like, I think it was last year, the year before, you did close a pretty significant capital raise for this particular region, right? So I think that shows that you guys are on the right track.
Yeah, look, I think if you get your business fundamentals right and your investors can see clear growth, what they're keen to see is that you've got a well-structured plan of execution. And I think that if we look at, the US in particular, particularly in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of companies in there that don't follow the principles of good business.
Yes, absolutely.
They raise loads of capital and then it goes nowhere. And then they're listed as another failure. The naysayers grab on that. But, the good news about in America is they've got the appetite to keep going with that. Over here, you don't get that opportunity. It's kind of one strike and you're out. But I think that if you look at our investors, they looked at our solid business fundamentals, saw the markets we're into, could see recognize the value of the products that we had and how we were applying them. And that's why they were keen to invest. And I think that I agree with you that the markets are challenging at the moment. But I think the fundamentals of tech will remain.
Absolutely.
And they're just going to get, so I see it as a lull rather than, end of the road kind of thing for this approach. Yeah, what I do think though,
go ahead.
I do think that there's going to be, much more intelligence by investors now looking at the fundamentals of tech companies.
Yeah, it's not going to be just here's $100 million on a whim. Like there has to be more control, because that did breed a lot of it wasn't the right thing. It just bred bad practice and bad valuations, and it was never a good thing. It was always going to blow up.
Yeah, and it wasn't good for anybody in the industry, to be honest, because you go through .com booms. I mean, we've both been through the .com crash. We've seen 2008. And the thing is, every time there's a dent in the market, people will look back at that point and go, "See, I told you so."
Yeah,
that didn't work. So,
and the strong companies prevail. The ones with the fundamentals go through.
Exactly, and so I think that this is not a bad thing. Corrections are never a bad thing if you take away the lessons that you learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I just wanted to finish off talking a little bit future thinking, and talk a little bit about, you mentioned it earlier, but data. You focus on data, right? Internet of Things. You've got the data from the Internet of Things devices, the data that you're protecting within the Office 365, everyday Teams data, SharePoint data, just email data. You're moving on to the Veeam Backup, which we'll talk about a little bit in terms of your futures, just to finish off. But where do you see data today, and how it's evolved from backup to more data management in general?
Look, I think the reality is that data backup, and I think Danny Allen talked about this at Veeam, is that data backup used to be seen as a very siloed, very dumb, boring. You're just taking a dump of everything, shoving it over there like a filing cabinet or an archive warehouse. We've all seen Indiana Jones, with that massive warehouse, we just shove stuff in there.
Yes.
And it's forever, right? That's kind of the principles of data backup as it used to be. With these, you and I both know there's massive tape libraries and so on and so on. But I think now what we're starting to see is people go, well, actually, this is useful. This can be mined. This can be utilized. We can do more with this.
Yeah.
I can also protect the organization. I can protect it against ransomware attacks. I can mine it to make sure it's clean, it's protected. I can even use, as I talked about in Veeam when I was up on the stage, we could interact with security devices. So that, for example, a ransomware attack comes in, the smart security devices say, hey, take a backup of the organization, make sure we're protected, give us a restore point. Yep. All these things are starting to become possible. And these are very exciting times, because we're not looking at, backup being a mundane, boring function that people kind of rolled their eyes and did. Now they're starting to see the value, elevating the art of the possible.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I personally, I've said this a few times, I never saw myself working for a backup company and thinking that would be where I'd end up. And even when I joined, I didn't think that it was I don't want to say it wasn't the coolest place. That probably isn't the right word, because it was pretty cool to work for a company like Veeam, right? But in terms of the industry that we're in, it's I didn't think it was as big as significant as what it's become effectively, and it's become almost the most important industry that exists out there in terms of IT. Because if you don't have that data stored, protected, then your business is at risk. But then on the flip side, what you're talking about, the future, if you can't make that data work for you in some way, there's a lot of talk about data gravity, but then activation of data as well. That's the future. So for those people that control the entry points and then the storage of that data, they're effectively going to own a good mind share moving forward in terms of how you make that data work for companies and organizations.
Yeah, and I think 100% right. And I was the same thing. I never envisaged myself being here either. If you look at back when we started CT4, 2009, being candid, data backup was a mundane function that we just had to do.
Exactly.
But I think we've done a full circle journey, in that we're back where we began, in that we're looking after people's most important assets. Back then we were hosting it, now we're protecting it.
Yeah.
But we're saying to customers, when you go to a customer and convince them to give their hard-earned dollars to you for the software, you go, look, we're not just going to look after it. We're going to do intelligent stuff with this. We're going to help you make this more effective. And one of the things I was talking to a customer the other day was, for example, if we came from another product, I'm going to pick on Symantec here, Symantec Backup Exec, we both know that from back in the day. And you went to, for example, a Veeam product, quite a lot, often people would just go, hey, I used to do it that way, so I did it this way. Same, different products, right? What we're being smart now. We're saying, hey, let's make it really easy for people to do really smart things with it. Let's give them the tools to do it. Let's take away, the fear and uncertainty that they're not going to read a 300-page manual, because then they're worried about what that means. We can actually make that and empower them to do that. And I think that's a super cool place.
Yeah. And again, like I said, this is why I started this podcast, why I had the idea, because I felt like there was a a space to talk about people at CT4 doing great things with the technology that exists. So again, it's the epitome of why I talk to people and companies like yourselves. So I'm really glad that you've, validated that in a way. So let's finish off. I want to just ask a couple of questions to finish off. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I think you mentioned the partnership with Veeam, and partnerships are very important for you. You've partnered with a few people to get the marketplace going as well, Microsoft and Ingram and a few other people. So what makes a good partner for you as a question?
That's a really good question. I think, look, it's got to be a win-win, right? It's got to be something in both of us. And I think why the partnership worked well with Veeam and is continuing to work well and is accelerating is Veeam obviously has a world-class product, backup engine. I've already covered that one off. And they saw the value in us being able to complement that journey to offer more on the marketplace, to take on competitors. So in my mind, that's a win-win journey, because what we're doing is we're going forward and we're saying there's something in it for both of us. It doesn't benefit just one of us. So whenever we look to partner with people, companies, organizations, whatever, the best partnerships are true partnerships. Otherwise, all you've got is a buyer-supplier relationship.
Yeah.
And that's pretty low, being candid.
Cool. Good answer. Excellent. All right, then. Well, we might wrap up. I think, obviously, if people want to know more, I'm going to put a lot of the links in the show notes. But obviously, CT4, look them up on Google. Go to the Azure Marketplace, type in Cirrus. You'll get some information up on there. And obviously, if you're looking to back up your Office 365 data, this is the place to go. So, please give them a go if you're interested. Anything else that you want to finish up on, Dan, before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I would say one thing on if you go to cirrusbackup.com, to your point about the product, and go to FAQs. One thing I absolutely love about our community is there's a link on there where you can actually put your ideas and submit them.
Awesome.
And if they make sense, we'll adopt them. And we've had some amazing, ideas come back from people about stuff they want to see in the product, and they genuinely love the fact they can influence the direction of the product. And I'm really appreciative of everybody's support and assistance in that.
Excellent. That's a really good initiative. I like that. And that just makes a better product for you guys and for future customers. So excellent. All right. Thanks, Dan. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying again, if you'd like to subscribe to GTWGT, you can find me at Anthony Spiteri or at GTWGT Podcast on Twitter. Obviously, the website is up at gtwgt.com. Again, please hit the subscribe button. But with that, it was great to talk to you, Dan, to talk about CT4, what you guys are focusing on. And we will see you next time on Great Things with Great Tech.
Thank you, Anthony.
Good stuff.